of Illinois graduate. Mr. Barton serves on the Illinois Crop Improvement Board of Directors. Ken, thank you for being with us. Let's turn the program over to you now at this time.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate your having me on this evening to do this webinar and everybody getting online. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to go back a slide, sorry. Anyway, just so you know, I've been fighting a little bit of a cold, so if you hear a few sniffles and coughs, I apologize that in advance. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about successful soybean rotation and talk quite a bit about coming out of a continuous corn program. So those are sort of the keys to the point. So let's go ahead and get started. The first slide I have here just gives you an idea of performance from a yield line from soybeans compared to corn, basically over the last 10 to 15 years, and how that yield line appears. Obviously, you can see, as most of us would assume, the corn yield line has advanced a little bit faster than soybeans have, but probably the most important thing is here, even beyond what we sometimes feel, the yields in soybeans have made quite a few great advances. And I would say if we had this just based upon the last 5 years, that would be even more significant. So keep that in mind. I know that there's always been over the years frustration with yield in soybeans, and are they really getting better or not better? And that's sort of the point with the first slide. So going to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a few different agronomic issues that we have with soybeans and where we go from there. So let's talk a little bit about nutrition, fertility, those type of things here at first. As I think most of us know that when it comes to nitrogen and fixating nitrogen, soybeans do a great job of doing that. And in the majority of the cases, you really don't need to necessarily have to supplement nitrogen with soybeans, and they can produce plenty to produce high yields in those 80 to 120 bushel yield lines here and in the future. I think the available nitrogen will be there. So going to the next slide. Whoops, I skipped too many. Back, sorry. Anyway, going to the next slide back on nutrition. This slide just sort of represents again what happens in a soybean plant from basically NP and K uptakes throughout a growing season. And you'll notice the first column is again the nitrogen uptake and what it takes, and we've discussed that briefly already in the slide previously. And then P and K are the two things that I wanted the takeaway here is those are the two things that you can help influence a lot in your fields by knowing what you need to do with your P and K levels when it comes to soybeans. Obviously, you can see soybeans when it comes to the fertility side, the uptake really starts at the reproductive stages and throughout the maturity of the soybean. That's where you really had the most use of these nutrients. So moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about pest control. And when we talk about pest control, I really mean pests, weeds, insects, pathogens as one big group here. And to really maximize yields on soybeans, this is important because this is something that growers can control, have a lot more control of than some other factors when it comes to growing soybeans in your field. So keep that in mind as we move forward. I think the issue always with growers especially comes around the cost of doing some of these different individual pieces when it comes to producing soybeans, especially when it comes to insects and fungicides for pathogens, those type of things, and whether it pays or whether it does not pay. So in this case, when we're really looking for high yield soybeans, especially after 5 years, let's say in a continuous corn or after a continuous corn production year, that's the year where you really need to pay probably closer attention to those things and be more willing to do those management practices and plan for those management practices ahead of time. So following a good integrated pest management program is highly recommended for high yields on soybeans. And the challenge we have is all too often, especially in a lot of growers are very hesitant in this particular case. The biggest thing is to make sure that you're planning again for a good integrated pest management program on your farm ahead of time. So to do that, you're really going to have to know your field history of your fields on your farms to really do that up front, and that's the kind of homework you can do well ahead in your planning stages pre-plant with whoever is advising you from a standpoint and the information you're getting from whatever source you can on your farms. So the next slide we discuss a little bit more about row spacing, and I'll be honest with you, I have mixed feelings when it comes to row spacing, but the data really does indicate that narrower rows can produce higher bushel amounts. I think the challenge that growers have with this is sometimes cost, and then especially when it comes to a drill, the seed placement of the seed in those scenarios. So I'm very comfortable with like 15 or 20 inch rows with a yield, and the big thing is just remember that if you're in narrower rows, it really depends on your farming operation and what kind of equipment and what you're comfortable with, because there's challenges disease-wise, specifically maybe in a scenario with white mold, those type of things, where narrow rows may be a detriment and not increase your yields also. So keep that in mind. So the second side of this slide, or the right side of this slide, really talks about, and the takeaway is the two items or columns that I have highlighted, which is really high yield in wide rows and higher yield in narrower rows. Is the takeaway from this slide. Don't necessarily look at the actual yield number to the left-hand side, but observe that in the case of wide rows, the best practices is not to leave out specific things in those practices, whether it's a inoculant, those type of things. If those are needed, don't leave them out, because leaving those things out can hurt your yield ultimately in the end. So if you're trying to maximize yields, you need to sometimes throw that kitchen sink at the deal. So variety selection, and this is near and dear to my heart, because this is really what I do as a day job for myself, and that is dealing with genetics and those type of things, and what works best on our soils, and where we go from there. So probably the most important thing, and one thing you do control, is what genetics you buy from Unity or whatever seed provider you might be using. So keep that in mind, that you need to look for the things that yield in your area, and be open-minded to new products, those type of things, because really the genetic gains are being made quite rapidly on soybeans with the newer genetic lines that you'll see. Disease resistance really comes very closely into that yield factor, because disease, what you got to remember, is what works in your area and what are specifically those things you're challenged by. And I know sometimes that's very difficult. I mean, there's always a lot of questions around cyst nematode, those type of things. So as much knowledge as you can gain from what you have in your fields is extremely important. Maturity is important, but as long as you're within a maturity range that's sort of safe for your area, and you're going to see on the right-hand side of this column, if you're really trying to maximize yield, if you look at that chart and you look at the two columns that got early below them, and then the right column that has normal, you can see that in early planting situations, and you'll hear the story more as we go through the presentation, is that your highest yields come from early planting, but the variation in early planting also is there. So keep that in mind. When you switch to a fuller season variety, the variation in the yield is more significant at this point. So that's when I would recommend, especially on your early fields, to plant a fuller season variety for your area. Then probably the next thing when it comes to variety selection is traits, and we're looking at traits like Roundup Ready to Yield, Extend, and List coming down in the future, those two at the bottom. But really Roundup Ready to Yield has made great advances genetically for most companies out there in far as yield, those type of things. It's from a breeder standpoint, it's much more easier to work with. We've been much easier to rapidly increase our yield lines. And I will tell you that we need to focus on the newer genetics, and honestly, most of the work is going to be done in the newer traits like Xtend, Enlist, those type of things as we go into the future. So it's crucial to keep your knowledge up. Make sure you're talking to your Unity rep here and talk to them about these products as the future comes. So last thing on this slide, breeding programs again are more focused on soy than ever before, and it's really because of those traits that are coming. So we're not only are we gaining new traits, but we're also gaining genetic yield. So crop growth rate, and we'll talk a little bit about this, and really what crop growth rate is going to focus around is when that crop is best able to produce seed, and it really has to do with light interception. And it's sort of like when you think of corn, you really think of heat units, those type of things that really is what are most important. When it comes to soybeans, it really has to do with light interception. In other words, and the varieties and how much they're really going to yield, and when that comes, and what stage you're at with that growth rate at that particular time, because it really boils down to the number of pods you set, the amount of seed you set within that soybean plant. Ultimately, that comes to you at harvest in dry matter. Where does the yield advantage come from is a question mark here. Well, it really comes from, again, that increased light interception through quicker canopy closure. So the quicker we close that canopy, the more leaf surface we have. We're not just absorbing that into the ground. That's extremely important to soybean yields. I realize you can't control the amount of sunlight you get, but you can control. The one thing you can control is potential planting dates. So increasing light interception increases dry matter, obviously on this slide, and increases the growth rate ultimately in seed yield. Well, the ideal time is canopy closure is usually by we want it by R3 or reproductive stage 3 is imperative to maximizing soybean yields. And then again, that canopy closure at R3 will maximize that growth rate, or basically what you're flowering at that point in time. So that's setting flowers is going to set pods. So canopy closure again increases also shading for weeds, so it's better weed control. Ultimately, we hopefully have good weed control even prior to this, but it can be very helpful in controlling weeds. So let's talk briefly about row spacing and water and what that all means to a soybean plant. So basically a rule of thumb, just quoting statistics here, it takes about an inch of water to produce 3 to 4 bushels per acre. And over the growing season, to produce 100 bushel, if that was our goal, we would need a whole bunch of gallons of water, which you can see at that 678,000 gallons per acre. So narrow rows will help reduce soil water evaporation. That may not be the issue some years, it may be other years, and it really depends upon timing and when. And once beans start maturing, they can handle droughier conditions probably better than corn can. But their roots are very deep, and they can tap into moisture pretty well. But it really depends on when the water comes. So let's talk a little bit about planting dates. That's really what I want to get to primarily here. Soybean yield benefits from early planting, very much so. Okay, and I would tell you probably 10, 15 years ago, my experience, I wouldn't have been so confident in saying that. But if you look at most university data, or even third-party data, or seed companies' data, early planting has become sort of a definite trend for soybeans, and it's affecting yield greatly. It results in increased photosynthesis, which we talked about previous to this, so that sunlight is important. And ultimately, what really happens there is we can gain a node to maybe 2 nodes more on a soybean main stem of that plant. And that's where really all your seed set is the majority of your seed set is going to take place. The majority of your yield is on that main stem. Yes, there are varieties that will that branch that set some pods on the outside, and that can help with yield. But the majority of those nodes and that node placement, where they are and how many you have, is a big determining factor ultimately of where your yields ends up being. So more rapid growth during that pod set obviously is important. We talked about that previously. And increased potential yield for early flowering, and ultimately the more flowers, the more beans ultimately you'll have in the long run, as long as more of those flowers stay attached. And you normally will lose quite a few flowers over the growing season, but that really doesn't matter as long as the nodes are there and you got good pod set. So the idea is to get a little bit longer per reproductive period, and that's why we're encouraging the early planting dates for soybeans. And ultimately that gives you seed fill. Your seed fill rate is higher, and usually during the best growing part of the growing season for seed set. So soybean yield advantage to early planting date sort of continued on here and somewhat summarized. Nodes develop basically from V1 to R5, so it's during that period of time. They're not terribly temperature driven. Remember, sunlight is the most important factor here. I mean, obviously we don't need extremes in temperatures for soybeans, but it's not nearly as important as that planting date and that sunlight retention. The node's accrual rate is around 3.7 days for a new node to develop. This really doesn't vary that much for that day length, the amount of time in between the planting date, but your chances of getting more nodes is greatly increased. But when soybean is planted later, again, there's fewer nodes that will develop just because of the lateness of it. So late planted soybeans, excuse me, there it comes, cannot catch up in terms of the amount of nodes. So let's talk a little bit about soybean planting date on this chart and give you an idea of what this all means. Basically, if we're looking at a higher yield environment, which would involve, let's say if we're talking after continuous corn, for 4 or 5 years, we're looking at yield potential that's significantly higher on a higher yielding environment, and that includes better soils than we are on a lower yielding environment potentially, because they come, as you can see to the chart, that comes later and later. But the early planting is a significant advantage over late planting when it comes to a higher yield environment. So yield loss occurred from early to late planting is significant here on this chart again, and low yield environments saw less yield, yield loss, early yield, than later planting. So again, what drives soybean yield? Ultimately, it comes down to dry matter and the amount of seed that's produced in that plant. And there's a few main things you got to remember here. It's the number of seeds, obviously, in that pod, which set during the reproductive 3 to 4 growth stages. And then it's also primarily seed size. And I will note to you that seed size is significant here. And a lot of you may have noticed over the at least last few years, especially if you've been planting newer genetics, especially maybe Roundup Ready yield type genetics, you probably noticed that a lot of the seed sizes seem to be bigger than they were historically, maybe 10 years back. That's somewhat intentional with a lot of the newer genetics. That's part of the yield factor when it comes to that. So remember that. Yeah, we have to have the seeds in the pod, and that's important. The seed size is significant. So the chart to the right, a little bit busy, a little bit confusing, but what the real story is here is the smaller the seed size. In other words, if it's like 3,500 seeds per pound for a pound of seed compared to like 2,500 seeds per pound, the 2,500 seeds per pound is significantly larger. And also, if you're talking about the same number of seeds, you're increasing your yields just by flat out seed size. So keep that in mind when you're looking for the highest yield. Seed size will be a big factor in your production. That does not mean, however, if you're buying seed, if the genetic potential for a small seeded variety is just as large as it is for a larger seeded variety when it comes in the bag as seed for you. That's really environmental influences that create that. So all we have to do is get more seeds and bigger seeds, right? It's really pretty well that simple. But getting there is a challenge, right? So this slide just talks a little bit, and it discusses not only beans ultimately after continuous corn. So this study was done, if you look at the first column number 1, that is a yield line. And again, don't focus on necessarily what the number is, but focus on the differences between these columns. And the yield line on number 1 is actually after 5 years of continuous corn. That's where that data comes. And then actually the next number 2, 3, 4, or 5 are really the yield numbers that are continuous beans, which I realize not very many people do continuous beans, but you will notice that it drops significantly in especially the third year of a continuous bean rotation, and then it pretty well just flattens out. But you're giving up pretty significant yield overall, so remember that. And continuous beans just stays pretty flat after that point usually, depending on the disease pressure, those type of things. But the last column to the far right, that's a corn-soybean rotation. In other words, if you were in a normal corn-soybean rotation pretty well every year, that's really your best bet overall, because your yields stay still significantly higher than a continuous situation, but maybe not as high as you would coming out of a continuous corn. So the top end yield maybe isn't as quite as high there, but you're going to give up something on the corn side or the bean side no matter where you go. So the next slide does focus around a no-till and conventional tillage. That's not really the point necessarily I'm trying to make here, because that's a much more involved conversation. Could be a whole nother webinar. If we're talking about no-till compared to conventional, that really depends on the audience, the farm, your farm, what the situation is, those type of things. But again, the takeaway of this is, again, column 1 is soybeans after continuous corn, and then the far right-hand column is in a corn-soybean rotation, and those both seem to be the best options in this particular case. So just another study that I pulled out was this is one study done by Pedersen and Lauer. That's Iowa, Wisconsin at the time, universities. This was after 5 years of continuous corn. Production on the soybeans was about 14% better yield than the remaining 6 rotational sequences when they rotated out of that. So that gives you an idea of your maximum yield is probably going to come potentially on soybeans. If you're coming out of a continuous corn rotation this year, for instance, your potential is really there. So my conclusions, where you have some control, that's really what this is all about, because some of these things you really don't have control of. But what can you control? I think number 1, honestly, at this point in time, that you have some control, and I realize the weather is part of this factor, is early planting. Number 2, the best genetics, and don't worry too much, I jumped one, and don't worry too much about the maturities. As long as they're within a reasonable range, I would prefer you went with the fuller season maturities within your zone. Be comfortable with it. But when it comes to maximum yield, that's probably where it's at. You know, I do realize that I would spread my maturities on all my production to a degree, because you don't want to just be in one maturity group, because every year you hear different comments. Well, my early beans did better this year, or my late beans did better this year. So, but in general, I think especially with early plantings, you saw on the earlier chart, the fuller season maturities are probably your best bet. And I'm not. Okay, make sure your P and K levels are at field recommended levels. That's extremely important today, and that's one thing you can control. Okay, so be looking at that. That's something a lot of growers don't look at. It doesn't seem to be, fertility isn't something that's foremost on their mind when it comes to soybeans. So, and the use of good integrated pest management plans, and stick to it. include treatments, include fungicides in your plan. Okay, there are things that you can pull back on, but if you are in an area that has had aphid issues maybe in the past, be prepared to do that. Talk to whoever is providing your inputs, those type of things, to make sure that they're going to have those products if we need those in those particular cases. Don't be the last guy on the block to get that, potentially an airplane or whatever out there to do this stuff. If you have any disease pressure from last year that you know of in your area, in your farms, plan for it. Look for the best varieties. Look for those products that may help with this certain disease, those type of things. If you know what kind of pressure you've had maybe with cyst nematode in the past, plan for that as best you can, okay, and whatever options you might have. So in conclusion, beans after continuous corn, in just my rule of thumb, and probably a rule of thumb that's in most people's minds, they've been in the agriculture business and we're dealing with soybeans for years, is that you really could be looking at about an average 10% increase in yield when it comes to beans after continuous corn. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, and he's going to talk to you about answering your questions. Thank you.
Soybeans had a very impressive season in first trials. A couple highlights including winning outright in the Howe, Indiana first trial, being the only brand to yield in excess of 90 bushel per acre with our 3031 Roundup Ready 2 variety. Also, Unity Seeds 3303 Roundup Ready 2 yielded over 82 bushel per acre in the Wolcott, Indiana first trial. We were equally excited about the performance of our corn hybrids in 2014. For example, Unity 7914 3000 GT, a 114-day hybrid, placed second overall in the 2014 Otterburn, Indiana first trial by yielding 260.6 bushel per acre. 7914 also yielded 13 bushels per acre, better than the average of the 54 hybrids in the 2014 Elverson, Pennsylvania first trial. Unity Seeds 5608 Smart Stack Refuge in the Bag, a 108-day hybrid, yielded 230.8 bushel per acre, which was 13.1 bushels per acre above the average of the 60 hybrids in the 2014 Greensburg, Indiana first trial. Also, our 4603 VT3 Pro Refuge in the Bag came in second place overall in 2 Iowa State University trials in 2013, Corworth, Iowa, and Sheldon, Iowa. Unity Seeds has been a consistent performer for several years now in the first trials and state university trials across the country. Let's see now what we have for questions. Okay, Ken, looks like our first question we have: in northern Indiana, with treated beans, how early is too early?
Well, as I stated maybe during the presentation, but my rule of thumb for soybeans is that if you're planting corn, you probably should be planting beans at the same time. So I'm not positive on exactly early, northern Indiana, southern Michigan, those type of territories. But I think if you're looking late April, that's probably a good time to be coming in early. I think if we get in much earlier in the first part of April, that might be a challenge. But you've got to look at the weather. But the best rule of thumb, honestly, is when are you planting corn, and if it's possible, you plant beans at the same time.
Okay, Ken. And it looks like our next question that just come in Do you recommend seed treatments for planting soybeans early?
Yes, I do. I mean, when it comes to especially early plantings, I think it's extremely cheap insurance from an emergence standpoint, and most of the current fungicide, insecticide type treatments, whether it be a Cruiser or a Acceleron type treatment, those type of things that are both insecticide fungicides, I think are extremely cheap insurance, and usually are an advantage to emergence and stands ultimately in the end. And I realize stands aren't as quite important when it comes to soybeans because of their ability to adapt, but it still is important at that point in time for a strong, healthy plant. And really it's all about maintaining a strong, healthy plant throughout the growing season.
Okay. All right. Another question we've got, what's the best management practice, or what do you think the best management practice is, or a recommendation for cooler, wetter soils associated with like early planting?
Well, back again, when it comes to early planting, again, using a good treatment is highly recommended. I wouldn't, if you got adequate moisture there, soybeans are very adaptable from an emergence standpoint. So don't get terribly concerned about it. And the early planting, usually moisture is not really an issue. That usually comes with later plantings when we delay our soybean planting, which can really hurt our stands and our emergence.
Okay. Looks like our next question is, with today's bean market, could it pay to hire a crop scout to track pest threats in my field and get a return on my investment?
Yeah, to hire a crop advisor, those type of things, I think it really depends on the area, and obviously it's like anything else. It's actually an input cost. Okay, so you got to determine how valuable that is to your operation. I think you can get a lot of information by just talking to your representative here at Unity. You can get information from different retailers in your area, those type of things that maybe you don't have to pay for. But if you have a crop advisor out there on your farm scouting your acres, it can be very profitable. But make sure you hire the right guy to do this job that you're comfortable with, that has a good reputation for your area.
Okay. Well, that looks like all the questions, Ken. And Ken, I want to thank you again for being here with us and also sharing some of your knowledge with us. I'm sure everyone heard you loud and clear when you said corn and beans in a rotation provide the best long-term stability. I felt another great point was the importance of planting earlier on the more productive ground with a fuller season variety. I certainly hope this information comes in handy for everyone during the 2015 crop year. Please join us March 26, 2015 at 8 p.m. Eastern for our next webinar on cover crops. Please check our website for details at unityseeds.com. Thank you again for sharing some of your time with us. Be sure to call one of our seed advisors here at Unity Seeds at 800-338-4558 for corn and soybean recommendations, and be sure to plant Unity Seeds for your top value in your 2015 seed investment. Thank you.